in every one of us. From the moment we are formed in the womb, God knows us, names us, and creates us in God's image to glorify God. In this morning's passage from Isaiah, the prophet proclaims, "While I was in my mother's womb, he named me. And he said to me, 'You are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified.'" In the book of Jeremiah, God tells the prophet, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." And St. Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, declares, "But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me." As we read these various statements, one has to begin to think that maybe John Calvin was right when he taught his doctrine of predestination. But these stories and these prophets' lives, as well as our own experience, tells us life is just not that simple. God did not create us as mere puppets to be controlled by the divine puppeteer. Instead, God created us in God's image and gave us free will. The ability to choose between what is God's dream for us and what we feel may be our own dreams. The story of Genesis exemplifies this. In the beginning, God created Adam and Eve to live in perfect harmony with God. God placed them in the garden with only one command, that they should not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the serpent, Satan, was seductive and beguiled the two with promises of being just like God. That promise, that temptation to be like God was just too great for Adam and Eve, as they turned their backs on God and what God wanted for them and chose their own path of disobedience and sin. In both the call of Jeremiah and of Isaiah, despite the intimacy with which God speaks to them, both offer up resistance to God's request for their lives. Both are overwhelmed and fearful of what God is asking them to do. Jeremiah protests that he's just a boy, so therefore he's just too young for this. Isaiah argues, "I don't know what to say." And in each situation, God prevails to persuade the prophet to accept God's dream and desire for their lives. In St. Paul's case, it is only after he is blinded by Christ on the road to Damascus that he finally sees the path that God has called him to, and that he is willing to give up persecuting Christians to become what was, and probably still is, the premier evangelist in all of Christian history. Like Jeremiah, like Isaiah, and like St. Paul, God has known each and every one of us and formed a dream for us before we were created in our mother's wombs. And part of our life's journey is to figure out exactly what that dream is and to live into that dream. Figuring out God's dream really isn't all that easy. We live in the midst of a cosmic battle between God and Satan, good and evil. And that battle doesn't just go on all around us, it goes on within our very hearts and souls. St. Ignatius taught that at some point in our lives, we have to make the choice between the two great standards of this universe, or the two great armies. First, the standard or army of Christ, or the second, the standard or army of Lucifer, the devil. The choice, he tells us, is difficult to make. Satan is seductive and beguiling. He tempts us with wealth, power, and prestige. Just think, in a few weeks' time, we will hear how bold Lucifer can be when he tempts Jesus in the desert with wealth through food, power by offering him the authority over all municipalities and nations, and ultimately divinity itself by encouraging Jesus to fall from the top of the Temple Mount. Becoming part of Satan's legion is very hard to resist. His seduction is subtle as he offers us what we want and what we desire. His initial offerings are innocent and then ensnare us through what become addictions. During the 4th century, St. Augustine taught that the scales of evil are stacked against us as we are born into the cloud of sin and evil itself. And this makes it hard, if not impossible, to differentiate between good and evil. And in fact, he says, even when we think we're doing good, many times we are doing evil. To our young people, I have often taught that nothing is innately good or evil until it becomes all-consuming and an addiction, and allows us to turn our backs on God. The call of Christ's legion often seems less attractive. The offerings of Christ are counterintuitive to what our wants and desires often are. In order to make ourselves fully open to the dream God holds for us, we have to first accept a position of spiritual poverty. Spiritual poverty is a total detachment from all worldly realities, such as riches and prestige. Spiritual poverty is the complete giving of ourselves and our lives over to God. The benefit of following Christ often doesn't feel or seem to be there in the short run. But in the long run, when we choose Christ over Satan, what we receive is perfect freedom. Freedom from the chains and bonds of sin. Freedom from worry, what we hold most dear. And the ability to trust more willingly in God's ability to take care of us. Choosing Christ over Satan leads to wholeness, even though we are broken, and to fulfillment, despite our own emptiness. In this morning's gospel, we heard John the Baptist proclaim on 2 occasions that Jesus is the Son of God. According to Luke's gospel, God formed John in Elizabeth's womb to be the prophet, or the harbinger, or the one who announces the arrival of the Most High. John received this role and took it seriously, and accepted both a life of spiritual and physical poverty. And he was very unique. But despite his oddness, John gained great prestige and notoriety throughout all of Israel and Judea. And for him to declare Jesus to be the Messiah, the Anointed One, had to come with a bit of bittersweetness. On the one hand, there was great joy. Finally, the one for whom his life work had been set up had arrived and was now present. But on the other hand, It meant now with Jesus at the forefront. It was John's time to fade to the background. And I suspect, had it not been for Salome, into historical obscurity. Based on today's gospel, this appears to be a transition that came easily and naturally to John. As he declared Jesus to be the Messiah, he in essence relinquishes what was perhaps most dear to him, his disciples, his followers, and he basically hands them over for Jesus to continue with. Throughout the centuries, those who committed their lives to the teachings of St. Ignatius have lived with one simple motto in mind: all for the greater glory of God. When we choose to stand with the standard of Christ and to live into the dream God formed for us in the womb, we ultimately give our lives to the greater glory of God. Isaiah and Jeremiah choose this when they accepted their call to be prophets. John the Baptist consummates his commitment to the greater glory of God when he releases his disciples into Christ's care. And as we begin to think about those to whom we have come to venerate as saints, one begins to realize that the common factor within all of them is how they live their lives to the greater glory of God. Just take a second and look at the lives of some of the saints. When we do that, we realize sainthood is not the result of patience or intelligence. St. Peter certainly tells us that. Sainthood is not based on diplomacy or physical prowess. St. Paul lacked those things. Sainthood has been found in those who are able to recognize, to accept the dream that God created them for, who are able to commit to that dream and live into that dream to the full glory of God. So this week, I invite you to take the time to spend with God and ask and seek what it is God has called you to do, what God's dream is for you in this world, and to once again devote your life to living it for the greater glory of God.